Case number 1. Joseph Paul Franklin. Between 1977 and 1980, an invisible predator waged a private, ideologically driven war across the United States. Moving from state to state with long-range hunting rifles and high-powered scopes, he stalked synagogues, interracial couples, and prominent civil rights figures, then vanished long before police could establish a perimeter. He was a lone wolf terrorist who believed he was fighting a race war. His name was Joseph Paul Franklin. Born James Clayton Vaughn, Jr. In April 1950, in Mobile, Alabama, Franklin grew up in poverty under an abusive, alcoholic father who spent long stretches away from the family before returning to beat his children. Isolated and angry, he drifted into extreme racial ideology as a teenager and eventually changed his name in tribute to Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and to Confederate General Benjamin Franklin. By his mid-20s, that hatred had hardened into an active campaign. He bought hunting rifles, taught himself long-range marksmanship, and began crisscrossing the country in a station wagon loaded with weapons and false identification, financing the spree with bank robberies and blood bank donations. His campaign opened in October 1977 outside a synagogue in Richmond Heights, Missouri, where he fired on a bar mitzvah gathering from a concealed position, killing 42-year-old Gerald Gordon and wounding 2 others. Over the following 3 years, he struck across Chattanooga, Atlanta, Madison, Salt Lake City, and beyond, hunting black men seen in the company of white women and interracial couples on public streets. In February 1978, he shot and killed Johnny Brookshire in Chattanooga, wounding his white girlfriend. On March 6, 1978, he ambushed Hustler magazine publisher Larry Flynt and his attorney Gene Reeves outside a Lawrenceville, Georgia courthouse, firing from roughly 150 feet with a .44 caliber rifle in retaliation for an interracial photo spread the magazine had run. Flynt was left paralyzed from the waist down. More than 2 years later, in May 1980, Franklin positioned himself near a hotel in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and shot civil rights leader Vernon Jordan as he returned from a late-night meeting, critically wounding him. It was an attack in Utah that ultimately unraveled him. On August 20th, 1980, Franklin took a sniper position in a vacant lot at the edge of Salt Lake City's Liberty Park and watched 4 joggers, 2 black men and 2 white women, cross a nearby street after dark. He opened fire with a high-powered rifle, killing 20-year-old Ted Fields and 18-year-old David Martin while their friends scattered. A surviving witness later described the moment the first round passed through Martin's body, spraying fragments into the street as the group tried to catch him before he fell. Franklin fired roughly half a dozen more shots before fleeing. Salt Lake City detectives worked the case hard, and the physical evidence and witness descriptions they gathered fed directly into a growing federal bulletin on the still unidentified shooter. Law enforcement finally caught up with Franklin in October 1980 at a blood bank in Lakeland, Florida, after an operator recognized his description and distinctive tattoos from that bulletin. FBI agents arrested him within hours. Investigators would eventually tie him to as many as 22 killings across 11 states, though he was convicted in connection with roughly 8. He was never charged in either the Flint or the Jordan shooting. Both confessions came years later, well outside any practical window for prosecution. In September 1981, a Utah jury convicted him of the Fields and Martin murders, and he was funneled into the high-security tiers of USP Marion to begin serving his sentences. Marion did not tame him. Just 3 days after his arrival, on February 3rd, 1982, a group of inmates stabbed Franklin 15 times in an apparent racially motivated attack, a reminder that even inside the nation's most controlled penitentiary, his own ideology had made him a target. He survived. In 1984, fearing further retaliation after assaulting a guard, Franklin gave investigators a taped confession from inside Marion, admitting to the 1977 murders of Alphonse Manning Jr. and Tony Schwen, an interracial couple gunned down in a Madison, Wisconsin park. He later tried to recant the confession at trial, claiming he had fabricated it to secure a transfer out of Marion, but a jury convicted him in February 1986 after deliberating for barely an hour, adding 2 more consecutive life terms. Franklin's legal odyssey stretched across 2 decades and multiple states. In 1997, despite a defense argument that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, a Missouri jury sentenced him to death for the 1977 murder of Gerald Gordon outside the Richmond Heights Synagogue. The same year brought a 40-year sentence in Ohio for the murders of Darrell Lane and Dante Brown. And in 1998, 2 more concurrent life sentences in Tennessee for the killing of William Tatum. His confessions also freed an innocent man. In 1997, Franklin admitted to 2 1979 murders in West Virginia, for which Jacob Beard had been wrongfully imprisoned since 1993. Franklin spent 15 years on Missouri's death row, fighting his execution through appeal after appeal. In the days before his death, he renounced the racist ideology that had defined his life. On November 20th, 2013, at 6:17 in the morning, Joseph Paul Franklin was executed by lethal injection at a state prison in Bonne Terre, Missouri. He was 63 years old, a sniper who had turned an entire country into hunting ground, contained for years inside the same tiers that would later hold the men who invented the modern Supermax. Case number 2. Timothy McVeigh. 9 a.m., April 19th, 1995, Oklahoma City. A 7,000-pound fertilizer bomb packed inside a rented Ryder truck detonated outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The blast tore away the entire north face of the 9-story structure, shearing off concrete columns and collapsing floors on top of one another. 168 people were killed, including 19 children inside a second-floor daycare center. Nearly 700 others were injured. It remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism ever committed on American soil. As emergency crews sifted through the rubble, federal agents launched the largest manhunt in the country's history. The man behind the bombing was a 27-year-old former Army sergeant named Timothy McVeigh. Born April 23, 1968, in Lockport, New York, Timothy James McVeigh was the only son and middle child of an Irish-American working-class family. His parents separated when he was 10 years old. His mother left with his 2 sisters, and McVeigh stayed behind with his father in the small town of Pendleton, New York. He grew into a quiet, withdrawn adolescent, bullied at school, and increasingly absorbed by survivalist literature, firearms, and computers, at one point hacking into a government computer network out of curiosity. In May 1988, McVeigh enlisted in the United States Army. He excelled, becoming a top turret gunner on a Bradley fighting vehicle with the 1st Infantry Division. Deployed to the Persian Gulf War in 1991, he was awarded a Bronze Star for his performance in combat. Encouraged by his success, he volunteered for Special Forces selection, but dropped out of the program after only 2 days, unable to keep pace with its physical demands. Disillusioned with the Army that had once defined him, he left the service with an honorable discharge in December 1991. Out of uniform, McVeigh struggled to settle into civilian life. He drifted between odd jobs and gun shows, grew increasingly paranoid, and immersed himself in anti-government conspiracy theories and the Turner Diaries, a novel depicting an armed race war that opens with the bombing of a federal building. His radicalization deepened after the 1992 standoff at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, and the 1993 siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. McVeigh actually traveled to Waco during the standoff to sell bumper stickers and hand out literature outside the police perimeter. When the compound burned to the ground on April 19, 1993, killing 76 people, McVeigh came to view it as an act of war waged by the federal government against its own citizens, and he began planning retaliation on the same date. Exactly 2 years later, over the following 2 years, McVeigh crossed the country on the gun show circuit, reconnecting with former Army acquaintances including Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier. Working out of rented storage units in Kansas, McVeigh and Nichols began accumulating the components for a bomb: thousands of pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, liquid nitromethane, and racing fuel. McVeigh chose the Murrah building specifically because its glass front faced a wide public plaza, a feature he believed would maximize the blast's destructive reach. On April 17, 1995, He rented a yellow Ryder truck under the alias Robert D. Kling, working with Nichols at Geary Lake State Park in Kansas. He packed the explosive mixture into barrels and wired dual-timed fuses inside the truck's cab. He then drove the bomb into Oklahoma City and parked it directly beneath the building's second-floor daycare center. After lighting the fuses, McVeigh walked calmly to a getaway car parked several blocks away. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated, destroying a third of the federal building. McVeigh heard the blast from a distance and drove north out of the city. 80 minutes later, Oklahoma State Trooper Charlie Hanger pulled McVeigh over on Interstate 35 near Perry, Oklahoma, for driving without a license plate. When Hanger noticed a concealed loaded pistol under McVeigh's jacket, he arrested him on a weapons charge, unaware he had just detained the man responsible for the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in American history. Investigators traced a rear axle recovered from the blast site back to the Ryder rental agency in Kansas, which led them to McVeigh's alias, and from there, to his booking photo in the Perry County Jail. In 1997, a federal jury in Denver convicted McVeigh on 11 counts of murder and conspiracy. On June 13, 1997, the jury recommended death. McVeigh was transferred to the newly built Special Confinement Unit at USP Terre Haute, becoming one of its first occupants. He showed no remorse, referring to the 19 children killed in the daycare as unavoidable losses in service of a larger cause. He waived his remaining appeals to accelerate his execution, wanting his death to serve as a final public statement against the federal government. His execution, originally scheduled for May 16, 2001, was delayed a month after the Justice Department admitted the FBI had failed to turn over more than 3,000 pages of trial documents to McVeigh's defense team. Attorney General John Ashcroft ordered a full inquiry and pushed the date to June 11. Courts ultimately found the oversight raised no doubt about McVeigh's guilt, and the execution proceeded. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was strapped to a gurney inside the execution chamber at USP Terre Haute. At 7:14 a.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection, the first federal execution carried out in the United States since 1963. McVeigh made no spoken final statement, instead handing prison officials a handwritten copy of the 1875 poem Invictus. His body was cremated, closing one of the darkest chapters in the history of American law enforcement. Case number 3, Richard Scutari. While Franklin hunted alone, USP Marion also held men who killed as part of an organized underground army. Between September 1983 and December 1984, a neo-Nazi group calling itself the Order, or the Silent Brotherhood, waged an 18-month campaign of armed robbery, counterfeiting, and assassination aimed at funding a whites-only nation in the Pacific Northwest. Its chief of security, the man responsible for keeping its killers hidden and its enemies silenced, carried the codename Mr. Black. His real name was Richard Scutari. Born April 30, 1947, in Port Jefferson, New York, Scutari drifted into the white power movement as an adult, eventually joining Robert J. Matthews' fledgling organization in September 1983. Matthews, a young Washington state tax protester radicalized within the Aryan Nations community around Hayden Lake, Idaho, built the Order's ideology on Christian identity teachings and on a novel that imagined an underground race war culminating in a whites-only nation. New members took an oath before an infant child, swearing loyalty unto death and vowing to overthrow what they called the Zionist occupation government. Scutari, older and far more disciplined than most of the group's young recruits, became its head of internal security, responsible for enforcing operational secrecy, vetting new members, and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose them. The Order financed its ambitions through violence. In April 1984, the group robbed an armored car in Seattle, and in July 1984, a dozen members, Scutari among them, ambushed a Brinks truck outside Ukiah, California, escaping with $3.6 million, one of the largest armored car heists in American history to that point. Members also printed counterfeit currency and funneled stolen cash to white supremacist organizations across the country. But the group's paranoia turned inward before it turned fully outward. In May 1984, fearing that member Walter West had become a security risk who might inform on the group, Order members drove him to a remote area near Boise, Idaho, beat him with a hammer, and shot him. His body has never been found. A month later, the Order turned its violence outward in the crime that would define it. On the evening of June 18, 1984, Order founder Robert Matthews, triggerman Bruce Pierce, driver David Lane, and Scutari staked out the Denver home of Alan Berg, a Jewish radio talk show host known for baiting white supremacist callers on air. When Berg stepped out of his car just before 10 that night, Pierce opened fire with a machine pistol, hitting him 12 times. Berg died in his driveway. Member Gene Craig had spent weeks surveilling his routine and relaying it back to Matthews. The FBI's investigation accelerated after member Thomas Martinez was arrested trying to pass counterfeit bills and turned informant. On December 8, 1984, agents cornered Matthews in a rented house on Whidbey Island, Washington. After a 2-hour firefight, the house burned to the ground with Matthews inside. 10 other Order members were arrested and convicted of racketeering and conspiracy by the end of 1985. Scutari was not among them. He had gone underground, working under an alias as a garage mechanic, and on September 30, 1985, the FBI placed him on its 10 most wanted list, the last member of the Order still at large. Agents traced him to a brake shop in San Antonio, Texas, where he had been working for months. He was arrested without incident on March 19, 1986, despite having vowed he would never be taken alive. In June 1986, a federal judge sentenced Scutari to 60 years in prison after he pleaded guilty to racketeering and conspiracy charges tied to the Ukiah robbery. He stood trial separately in 1987 for violating Alan Berg's civil rights alongside Pierce, Lane, and Craig. Only Pierce and Lane were ultimately convicted in connection with the killing itself, while Scutari's sentence remained tied to the broader conspiracy. Scutari served his decades inside the federal system's most restrictive units, ultimately landing in USP Marion's Communications Management Unit in July 2008, a designation created after September 11, 2001. Reserved for inmates whose outside contacts authorities want tightly monitored and controlled. Even from inside, he stayed connected to the movement, corresponding for years with white supremacist leaders in the United States and Europe, and advising a new generation of extremists on strategy. Telling one correspondent that those who believed revolution was not yet at hand should spend the intervening years building a cultural foundation rather than acting rashly. After serving roughly 38 years, longer than any other member of the Order, Scutari was released from federal custody in January 2025, walking free from a pre-release center in Orlando, Florida. Decades after the assassination, he helped plan from a stakeout car on a quiet Denver street. Case number 4, Joseph Edward Duncan III. May 16, 2005, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Neighbors grew alarmed when no one answered the door at a rural home outside town. When police entered, they found a scene of extraordinary violence. 3 people, Brenda Groane, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and her 13-year-old son Slade Groane, lay dead inside. Bound with zip ties and beaten to death with a claw hammer. 2 children, 8-year-old Shasta Groane and 9-year-old Dylan Groane, were missing. The house had been wiped clean of evidence, and the killer had vanished into the wilderness with both children. The man responsible was a convicted child predator named Joseph Edward Duncan III. Duncan was born February 25, 1963, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where his father was stationed with the Army. The family relocated frequently over the following years, eventually settling in Tacoma, Washington, where Duncan spent the remainder of his childhood and teenage years. By age 15, Duncan was already showing severe warning signs. In 1978, he assaulted a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint in Tacoma, his first recorded sexual offense. Arrested the following year for driving a stolen car, he was sent to a juvenile facility, where a therapist evaluating him concluded that he had sexually assaulted as many as 13 boys by that point in his life. In 1980, at age 17, Duncan stole a neighbor's firearm and abducted a 14-year-old boy at gunpoint, sexually assaulting him before letting him go. Tried as an adult, Duncan was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served 14 of those years before being paroled in 1994. While incarcerated, Duncan maintained an outwardly compliant record, completing college courses and learning computer programming, skills he would later use to build a public presence online. After his release, he routinely violated the terms of his parole, absconding from supervision and drifting between temporary jobs across the Pacific Northwest. During his years as a fugitive, Duncan began documenting his psychological state on a public blog, posting cryptic entries about control, predatory fantasies, and his ongoing search for victims along rural highways. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder by prison psychologists years earlier, a diagnosis that did nothing to slow his access to potential targets. In May 2005, while driving near Interstate 90 outside Coeur d'Alene, Duncan spotted Shasta and Dylan Groen playing in their front yard. He surveyed the home for several days, assembling tools, night vision equipment, and restraints in preparation for an attack. On the night of May 15, Duncan broke into the Groen residence. He bound and killed the 3 adults with a hammer, then wrapped the 2 children in blankets and drove them roughly 400 miles to a remote campsite in the Lolo National Forest in Montana. For 7 weeks, a multi-state manhunt searched for Shasta and Dylan while Duncan kept them at the campsite. He subjected both children to weeks of sustained physical and sexual abuse and eventually shot and killed 9-year-old Dylan in front of his sister. On July 2, 2005, Duncan brought Shasta to a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene. A waitress recognized her from Amber Alert broadcasts that had been running for weeks and called 911. Police arrested Duncan in the restaurant parking lot without incident. Confronted with overwhelming physical evidence, Duncan eventually confessed to the Groen murders. During pretrial proceedings, he chose to represent himself, using the platform to deliver rambling, erratic statements while declining to cross-examine prosecution witnesses. Investigators who reviewed Duncan's computer records and years of travel history linked him to earlier unsolved cases. He confessed to the 1997 kidnapping and murder of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in Beaumont, California, and to the unsolved 1996 murders of 2 young girls in Seattle, Washington, in October 2006. Duncan pleaded guilty in Idaho State Court to first-degree murder and kidnapping charges connected to the deaths of Brenda Groen, Mark McKenzie, and Slade Groen. The plea deal spared Shasta from having to testify and resulted in 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. Federal prosecutors then pursued a separate capital case tied specifically to Dylan's kidnapping and murder, since that crime crossed state lines into Montana. In August 2008, a federal jury in Idaho sentenced Duncan to death on those charges. He was separately convicted and sentenced to 2 additional life terms in California courts for the murder of Anthony Martinez. During his federal sentencing hearing, prosecutors introduced video recordings Duncan had made of the abuse inflicted on the children at the Montana campsite, material he had also attempted to distribute online before his arrest. The recordings became central evidence in establishing the deliberate, sustained nature of his crimes. Duncan was transferred to the Special Confinement Unit at USP Terre Haute, where he spent over a decade filing appeals while continuing to post to his blog through intermediaries on the outside. His attorneys attempted to challenge his mental competency, arguing his history of trauma and violence made him unfit for execution, but his death sentence survived every appeal. Before his execution could be scheduled, Duncan was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. On March 28, 2021, Joseph Edward Duncan III died in a hospital facility in Terre Haute at age 58, leaving behind a record as one of the most prolific and unrepentant child predators in American criminal history. Case number 5. Robert Lee Willie. In the late spring of 1980, a wave of abduction, rape, and murder swept across the back roads and bayous of southern Louisiana. A sadistic predator, working alongside a young accomplice, terrorized several parishes in the span of days, leaving communities afraid to answer their doors after dark. The man behind it was Robert Lee Willie. Born January 2, 1958, in Mandeville, Louisiana, Willie came from a family already steeped in violence. His father served 27 years in the Louisiana State Penitentiary across multiple stretches, including a second-degree murder conviction. Willie himself compiled a long juvenile record of assault, burglary, and weapons charges before he turned 18. In May 1978, he and his cousin Perry Wayne Taylor beat and drowned 19-year-old Dennis Hemby, then stole his marijuana, a killing Willie would not confess to for years. In May 1980, fresh out of state custody, Willie partnered with 24-year-old Joseph Vaccaro. On May 28, the pair picked up 18-year-old Faith Hathaway, who was walking home after celebrating her upcoming enlistment in the United States Army. They drove her to a remote wooded area in Washington Parish, raped her, and Willie stabbed her to death, leaving her body in the brush, where it was not discovered for several days. Barely a week later, the two abducted 16-year-old Debbie Morris and her boyfriend Mark Holbrook from a roadside stop outside Madisonville. After robbing and binding Holbrook and leaving him behind, Willie took Morris on a multi-state ordeal that stretched across Louisiana and Mississippi, repeatedly assaulting her over several hours while boasting that he felt no guilt over killing and describing prior murders in detail. Morris survived by staying calm, memorizing details of the truck and Willie's mannerisms, and eventually talking her way free. Her account, which she later published in the memoir Forgiving the Dead Man Walking, gave investigators the details they needed to trace the two men across state lines and connect them to Hathaway's murder. Willie and Vaccaro were captured in June 1980. Willie's trial became a national flashpoint in the debate over capital punishment, in part because of his conduct in the courtroom, where he smiled at Hathaway's family and spoke to reporters about his crimes with open contempt. He was convicted of first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and kidnapping, and received a Louisiana death sentence. He separately pleaded guilty to federal kidnapping charges in the Morris and Holbrook case, calculating that Louisiana could not execute him while he remained in federal custody. He was wrong. Federal authorities agreed to transfer him back to state custody, but not before he spent time inside USP Marion, where his sadistic record and Aryan Brotherhood ties marked him as a high-security threat, requiring constant separation from the general population. He remained there until 1983, when he was transferred to the Louisiana State Penitentiary to await his execution. Vaccaro stood a separate trial for his role in the Hathaway murder and the Morris-Holbrook kidnapping. A juror who had been excused from Willie's trial over her stated opposition to capital punishment was seated for Vaccaro's after telling the court she could impose a death sentence if the evidence warranted it. She ultimately became the sole holdout against it. And because Louisiana law required a unanimous vote for execution, Vaccaro received life instead. He served his sentence at USP Leavenworth, Kansas, and died there in January 2008 at the age of 55. While on death row, Willie confessed to the 1978 murder of Dennis Hemby, adding another life sentence, and admitted to killing a hitchhiker and a truck driver whose identities were never confirmed. He also confessed, then later recanted, to the murder of a Louisiana deputy sheriff, a case for which two other men had already given false confessions. It was on death row that Willie became one of two condemned men whose stories shaped Sister Helen Prejean's ministry. The Catholic nun served as his spiritual advisor through his final months, corresponding with him and sitting with him through his last day, and her account of that experience, woven together with her earlier work counseling a second death row inmate, became the basis for her 1993 book, Dead Man Walking. The 1995 film adaptation, starring Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn, drew its central condemned character largely from Willie, blended with elements of the other man Prejean had counseled. On December 28, 1984, Robert Lee Willie was executed in Louisiana's electric chair at Angola. He was 26 years old, remembered as one of the most remorseless predators to pass through both Louisiana's death row and the federal system's highest security tiers. Case number 6. Corey Johnson. Over 45 days in early 1992, the streets of Richmond, Virginia, turned into a war zone. Residents barricaded themselves inside their homes as rival dealers, suspected informants, and bystanders were shot and stabbed in broad daylight. One victim was shot and then stabbed 18 times in an alley. Another was shot 15 times over an unpaid drug debt. 13 people were killed before federal investigators brought down the group responsible, a crack cocaine trafficking operation that used murder as a routine business tool. Its chief enforcer was a young hitman named Corey Johnson. Johnson was born November 5, 1968, in New York City. His childhood was marked by severe instability. According to records his defense team later uncovered, Johnson was physically abused by his mother and her boyfriends and was abandoned by his mother at age 13, after which he was shuffled between residential facilities and the foster care system for years. Childhood testing placed his IQ as low as 69, and by his own attorney's account he could read and write only at an elementary school level. By the late 1980s, Johnson had connected with Richard Tipton, a fellow New Yorker, and the two began a drug partnership that started in Trenton, New Jersey. When James Rohn Jr. joined the operation in late 1991, the group relocated its base of operations to Richmond, Virginia, establishing a crack cocaine distribution network centered on the Newtown public housing complex in the city's Carver neighborhood. Johnson quickly became the organization's primary enforcer. While Tipton and Rohn managed supply lines and territory, Johnson carried out the killings that protected the gang's monopoly over local street corners. Anyone suspected of stealing drug proceeds, selling on their turf, or cooperating with police became a target for elimination. In January 1992, the gang murdered Lewis Johnson, accused of stealing drug money from the operation. Over the following weeks, the group carried out a string of additional killings, including Douglas Moody, who was shot and then stabbed 18 times after surviving the initial gunfire, and Peyton Johnson, killed simply for being present at the wrong location at the wrong time. In total, the gang was linked to 13 murders across the Jackson Ward, Gilpin Court, and Carver neighborhoods of Richmond. The organization sourced powder cocaine from contacts in New York, cooked it into crack in makeshift kitchens, and distributed it through a network of 30 to 40 street-level dealers who answered to Johnson's crew. A fourth key member of the operation, Vernon Thomas, was also charged in connection with the killings. Unlike Johnson, Thomas was found to be intellectually disabled and received a life sentence rather than death, a distinction Johnson's attorneys would later cite as evidence of an inconsistent application of the law. The sudden spike in homicides drew the attention of the Richmond Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Agents built a racketeering case using wiretaps and testimony from cooperating former associates who agreed to flip in exchange for reduced sentences. In the spring of 1992, federal agents arrested Johnson, Tipton, and Rohn, indicting them under continuing criminal enterprise statutes that allowed capital punishment for drug-related murders. At trial, prosecutors presented ballistic evidence and eyewitness testimony identifying Johnson as the gang's shooter in multiple killings. In February 1993, a federal jury convicted Corey Johnson of murder in aid of racketeering and related charges tied to 7 homicides attributed to the gang. The jury recommended death for each of the 7 counts, making Johnson one of the first people sentenced under federal drug kingpin legislation passed in the late 1980s. Johnson was transferred to the Special Confinement Unit at USP Terre Haute, where he remained for nearly 3 decades. His attorneys spent years arguing that his documented intellectual disability made his execution unconstitutional, citing childhood 1Q scores that surfaced only after his original sentencing and had never been presented to the jury. Johnson's legal team also argued, separately, that he should be eligible for a reduced sentence under the First Step Act, a 2018 federal sentencing reform law, but that argument was likewise rejected by the courts that reviewed his case over the following years. In late 2020, the Department of Justice scheduled Johnson's execution alongside a wave of other federal death sentences carried out that year, part of a broader resumption of federal capital punishment after a 17-year pause. His legal team filed emergency appeals, citing his intellectual disability and a case of COVID-19 he had contracted inside the prison, arguing that executing a man with a documented cognitive impairment violated constitutional protections established by the Supreme Court in earlier rulings. Federal courts, including the Supreme Court itself, declined to intervene, and the execution proceeded as scheduled. That on January 14, 2021, Corey Johnson was executed by lethal injection at USP Terre Haute. He was pronounced dead at 11:34 p.m. He was 52 years old. Asked if he had any final words, Johnson looked toward the room reserved for his family, said he was fine, and told them he loved them. In a written statement released afterward by his attorneys, he apologized to the families of his victims, naming each of the people he had killed and asking that they be remembered. His co-defendants, Richard Tipton and James Rohn Jr., remain on federal death row with no execution date set. Case number 7. Thomas Silverstein. By the late 1970s, the federal prison system faced a crisis of internal violence it had never seen before. Prison gangs fought for control of yards and cell blocks, and the Aryan Brotherhood used targeted killings to hold its ground. Its most feared operator inside USP Marion, a man the Tears came to know as Terrible Tom, was Thomas Silverstein. Born Thomas Edward Conway on February 4, 1952, in Long Beach, California, Silverstein was adopted by his mother's third husband and took his name. A teenage heroin habit led him into armed robbery, and at 19 he was sent to San Quentin. He was paroled after about 4 years, but reoffended almost immediately, committing more robberies alongside his father and a cousin. In 1977, at 23, he was sentenced to 15 years and sent to USP Leavenworth, Kansas, where he joined the Aryan Brotherhood and quickly proved willing to carry out gang-ordered killings without hesitation. His body count grew from there. In 1980, Silverstein was convicted of murdering fellow Leavenworth inmate Danny Atwell, who had refused a Brotherhood order to smuggle drugs into the prison. A court later overturned that conviction on appeal after ruling the witnesses against him unreliable. Though by then, Silverstein had already been transferred into USP Marion's control unit, a virtual solitary confinement wing built for the system's most disruptive inmates, and had already been convicted of a second prison killing. In 1981, Silverstein and fellow Aryan Brotherhood member Clayton Fountain were convicted of murdering Robert Chappelle, a member of the rival DC Blacks prison gang, whom they strangled in his cell. While Silverstein stood trial for that killing, the Bureau of Prisons transferred Raymond Cadillac Smith, the national leader of the DC Blacks, into the same control unit, and prison logs later showed Smith began plotting to kill Silverstein the moment he arrived. On September 27, 1982, Silverstein and Fountain struck first, cornering Smith with improvised weapons and stabbing him 67 times before dragging his body up and down the tier in view of other lockdown inmates. By October 1983, Silverstein believed he was being deliberately harassed by Marion's staff, particularly a veteran officer named Merle Klutz, whom he blamed for confiscating his artwork and mail. On the morning of October 22, as Klutz and 2 other officers escorted him back from a shower, Silverstein paused at a particular cell door. An inmate inside, Randy Gomez, reached out and unlocked Silverstein's handcuffs with a smuggled key, then passed him a homemade shank. Silverstein turned on Klutz and stabbed him roughly 40 times in the corridor. The officer died at the scene. Hours later, in a coordinated strike, Silverstein's partner Clayton Fountain killed a second officer in a separate wing of the prison. The double killing shattered the federal system's confidence in traditional maximum security architecture. Marion was placed on an immediate, indefinite lockdown that lasted more than 2 decades, and the model it created, permanent isolation as a management tool, became known as Marionization, the blueprint for every Supermax facility built since. For Silverstein personally, the consequences were unprecedented. The Bureau of Prisons constructed a special, soundproofed cell with continuous lighting designed to cut him off from all human contact, and placed him under a no-human contact order that would last more than 3 decades. He could not see, speak to, or touch another person without multiple armed guards and full restraints present, and correctional officers refused to speak to him at all, out of loyalty to Klutz. He was moved between Marion, Leavenworth, Atlanta, and eventually Colorado as the Bureau searched for a permanent solution. And in July 2005, he was placed in a purpose-built soundproof cell at the new ADX Florence Supermax. In 2007, lawyers from the University of Denver filed a civil rights lawsuit on his behalf, arguing that decades of indefinite isolation violated the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The courts ultimately upheld his confinement, ruling that his standing as a top Aryan Brotherhood leader meant retirement from the gang, and the threat he posed effectively did not exist. Silverstein spent his final years corresponding with author Pete Early on an autobiography and became, in the eyes of some inmates, a mythic figure who had never bent to the Bureau of Prisons. He died behind bars on May 11, 2019, at the age of 67, having spent more than half his life in near total isolation, the permanent proof of the system he had personally forced into existence at Marion. Case number 8. Dustin Lee Honken. July 25, 1993, Mason City, Iowa. 5 people vanished without a trace. Among the missing were Greg Nicholson, a federal drug informant preparing to testify against a Midwest methamphetamine operation, his girlfriend Lori Duncan, and her 2 young daughters, 10-year-old Condi and 6-year-old Amber. Months later, a second informant, Terry DeJuice, disappeared as well. For 7 years, their disappearance remained unsolved, while the man responsible for it walked free. That man was Dustin Lee Honken. Honken was born March 22, 1968. In Britt, Iowa, his father had served time for bank robbery, exposing Honken early to a criminal model, despite his own considerable intelligence. Honken studied chemistry in college, and rather than pursuing a conventional career, he used that training to manufacture high-purity methamphetamine on an industrial scale. In the early 1990s, working with an associate named Timothy Cutcomb, Honken built a methamphetamine operation across rural Iowa that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. He brought in a local dealer, Greg Nicholson, to help move product through Mason City, and entered into a relationship with Angela Johnson, who assisted with logistics and the management of lower-level associates in the network. In March 1993, federal agents arrested Nicholson on drug charges. Facing years in prison, Nicholson agreed to cooperate and testify before a grand jury against Honken. Recognizing that his operation was on the verge of collapse, Honken decided to eliminate the threat before it could reach a courtroom. On July 25, 1993, while free on bond awaiting his own trial, Honken and Angela Johnson went to the home where Nicholson had been staying with his girlfriend, Lori Duncan, and her 2 daughters. Johnson reportedly gained entry by posing as a cosmetics saleswoman. The pair forced all 4 into a vehicle, drove them to a wooded area outside Mason City, shot them, and buried them in shallow graves. 10-year-old Condi and 6-year-old Amber were still in their swimsuits when they were killed. Months later, Honken lured a second potential witness, Terry DeJuice, to a remote field, beat him, and shot him to death as well. Without bodies or physical evidence, federal prosecutors were initially forced to drop the primary drug charges against Honken for lack of a cooperating witness. But agents with the FBI and ATF refused to close the case, keeping him under surveillance for years while the disappearances went unsolved. In 2000, investigators caught a break. Angela Johnson, incarcerated while awaiting trial as a co-defendant on federal charges related to Honken's case, drew a hand-drawn map of the burial sites and passed it to a fellow inmate, who turned it over to federal authorities. In October 2000, FBI agents used the map to recover the remains of all 5 victims from shallow graves near Mason City, finally confirming what investigators had suspected for 7 years. In 2004, Honken stood trial in federal court in Sioux City, Iowa, charged with multiple counts of murder committed in furtherance of a continuing criminal enterprise. On October 14, 2004, the jury convicted him on all counts. Roughly a year later, on October 11, 2005, the same court formally sentenced him to death. with jurors recommending capital punishment specifically for the murders of the two children, Amber and Condi Duncan. Angela Johnson was separately sentenced to death as well, becoming the first woman sentenced to death by a federal jury since the 1950s, though her sentence was later overturned and reduced to life without parole. Honken was transferred to the Special Confinement Unit at USP Terre Haute, where he spent the next 15 years exhausting his appeals. While incarcerated, he converted to Catholicism and spent much of his remaining time studying theology. At his 2005 sentencing, Honken denied killing anyone, a claim that stood in direct contradiction to the physical evidence recovered from the burial site. Honken's execution had originally been scheduled for January 2020, but legal challenges pushed the date back to that summer, placing it in the same week the federal government resumed capital punishment after a 17-year hiatus, executing 3 men in 5 days. On July 14, 2020, a federal judge denied Honken's final request to delay the execution on coronavirus-related grounds, ruling that the Bureau of Prisons was better positioned to weigh the risk. In July 2020, the Department of Justice cleared the way for Honken's execution to proceed after nearly 2 decades of legal delay. On July 17, 2020, Dustin Lee Honken was executed by lethal injection at USP Terre Haute, pronounced dead at 3:36 p.m. local time. His last meal was an order from Pizza Hut, and his final words were a recitation of the Hail Mary. He was 52 years old, the first person connected to an Iowa case to be put to death by the federal government since 1963. The case remains one of the starkest examples in American legal history of how far a criminal organization will go to silence the witnesses standing between its leader and a prison cell. Case number 9. Clayton Fountain. While Silverstein built his reputation through calculated gang warfare, his closest partner in violence brought something different to USP Marion: military training and a body count that started before he ever set foot in a federal prison. Clayton Fountain was a former Marine turned prison enforcer who treated murder as a routine tool of control. Born September 12, 1955, at Fort Benning, Georgia, Fountain was the oldest of 6 children in a family that moved often to follow his father's military postings. He joined the United States Marine Corps himself, but his service ended in catastrophe. In 1974, while stationed in the Philippines, Fountain broke into an armory, stole and disassembled a pistol, and used it ashore to disarm a Filipino guard of his shotgun. He then used that shotgun to kill his staff sergeant, a man named Rin, who had recently reprimanded him for a uniform violation, shooting him once in the chest without a word exchanged between them. Fountain took 5 hostages afterward before he was subdued. He was court-martialed, sentenced to life imprisonment, and turned over to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. His violence did not end with the military conviction. On May 20, 1975, at USP Leavenworth, Kansas, Fountain and fellow inmate Hugh Collum stabbed prisoner Robert J. Stewart to death. Both men were convicted of voluntary manslaughter for the killing. By the time Fountain arrived at USP Marion, he had already killed twice. At Marion, Fountain joined the Aryan Brotherhood and became one of Thomas Silverstein's closest allies. In 1981, the 2 men strangled rival gang member Robert Chappelle in his cell, and in September 1982, they stabbed DC Black's leader, Raymond Cadillac Smith 60, 7 times, dragging his body down the tier as a warning to the rest of the block. By October 1983, Fountain had accumulated 4 killings across 2 institutions, a record that made prison officials view him as one of the most dangerous men in the federal system. Both he and Silverstein were by then escorted everywhere by 3 unarmed guards, handcuffed and kept apart from each other, a protocol designed to stop them from killing one another that never accounted for the possibility they would turn on the guards instead. The defining moment of his life arrived on October 22, 1983, hours after Silverstein murdered Officer Merle Klutz in a separate wing. As Fountain was being escorted through a corridor, he used a hidden key to slip his handcuffs, produced a concealed shank, and attacked Correctional Officer Robert Hoffman as Hoffman tried to pull him off another guard. Fountain stabbed Hoffman to death and seriously wounded 2 other officers who intervened. The coordinated killing of Klutz and Hoffman on a single morning pushed Marion into the permanent lockdown that would define the rest of its history. Bureau of Prisons officials concluded that housing Fountain near any other human being, staff, or inmate was too great a risk to manage. They built a self-contained isolation cell inside Marion's control unit specifically for him, a cell within a cell, cutting him off completely from the rest of the population. Fountain spent years inside that custom-built underground cell of steel and concrete, and over time, isolation changed him. He converted to Catholicism, completed an associate degree in business and a bachelor's degree through correspondence coursework with a Catholic distance university, and by his own account and that of the clergy who corresponded with him, came to feel genuine remorse for the men he had killed, a transformation stark enough that one prison counselor who had known him for years struggled to reconcile the calm, literate letters of his later life with the man who had once tried to kill him too. He was eventually moved to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, and remained under strict isolation, allowed contact only with authorized personnel for the rest of his life. Clayton Fountain died of a sudden heart attack on July 12, 2004, at that facility. He was 48 years old. His actions alongside Silverstein on a single October morning remain one of the clearest reasons the modern Supermax prison exists at all. Case number 10, Dustin Higgs. January 27, 1996, Prince George's County, Maryland, a snow-covered access road running through the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center became an execution ground. A passing motorist discovered the bodies of 3 young women, Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishan Chin, lying along the shoulder of the road. Each had been shot multiple times in the chest and head. The investigation traced back to a late-night apartment gathering and an argument over a rejected advance. The man behind the killings was Dustin John Higgs. Higgs was born March 10, 1972, in Poughkeepsie, New York. He later moved to Prince George's County, Maryland, where he dropped out of school and became involved in petty theft, illegal firearms, and small-scale drug dealing around the town of Laurel. By early 1996, 23-year-old Higgs shared an apartment in Laurel with his friend Willis Haynes. The apartment was a regular gathering spot for local acquaintances to drink and socialize. On the evening of January 26, 1996, Higgs, Haynes, and an associate named Victor Gloria drove into Washington, D.C., and brought 3 young women, Tanji Jackson, Tamika Black, and Mishan Chin, back to Higgs's apartment for a party. During the gathering, Jackson rejected a romantic advance from Higgs, and a heated argument followed. As the women collected their coats to leave, Higgs offered to drive them home, instead of taking them back into the city. He directed Haynes to pull into a secluded stretch of the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, federal land inside Prince George's County. Higgs handed Haynes a handgun and ordered him to make sure the women were dead. Haynes forced the 3 women out of the vehicle and shot each of them before the 2 men drove away. Park rangers discovered the bodies the following morning. Because the killings occurred on land belonging to the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, federal property despite sitting inside Prince George's County, the FBI took jurisdiction over the case rather than local Maryland authorities. A distinction that would later determine whether the men faced the death penalty at all, since Maryland itself had no functioning capital punishment framework for the case. Investigators used an address book recovered from Jackson's belongings to trace her final movements back to Higgs's apartment, identifying Higgs, Haynes, and Gloria as suspects. The 3 men evaded prosecution for nearly 2 years before a related drug investigation in 1997 brought fresh scrutiny to Higgs's apartment. In December 1998, federal agents formally arrested Higgs, Haynes, and Gloria in connection with the murders. Gloria agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for leniency, testifying that Higgs had supplied the weapon, ordered the killings, and threatened his companions into silence afterward. Higgs stood trial in federal court in 2000. Prosecutors argued that although Haynes fired the fatal shots, Higgs orchestrated and directed the murders as the group's ringleader, handing Haynes the weapon and issuing the order to kill. His defense maintained that he never ordered anyone killed and had simply been present in the vehicle. Haynes also stood trial separately in 2000, where he was convicted by a jury and sentenced to life in prison without parole plus 45 years. On October 11, 2000, a federal jury in the District of Maryland convicted Higgs of first-degree murder, felony murder, and kidnapping resulting in death, and recommended a sentence of death on all counts. Higgs was transferred to the Special Confinement Unit at USP Terre Haute, held alongside Willis Haynes, who was serving his life sentence in the federal system. Higgs spent 2 decades pursuing appeals centered on prosecutorial conduct and the reliability of accomplice testimony used to convict him. In 2012, Haynes signed a sworn affidavit stating that Higgs had never threatened or forced him to kill the 3 women, directly contradicting the government's theory of the case at trial. Higgs's legal team used the affidavit to press for clemency, and nearly 2 million people signed a petition asking the federal government to halt the execution. Despite the affidavit and a case of COVID-19 contracted inside the prison, the Supreme Court denied a final request for a stay in the early hours of January 16, 2021. Dustin John Higgs was pronounced dead at 1:23 a.m. inside the execution chamber at USP Terre Haute. He was 48 years old, becoming the 13th and final federal inmate executed during the 2020 to 2021 wave of federal executions, carried out just 5 days before the end of the presidential administration that had resumed them. His son, born after Higgs's arrest in 1998, never knew his father outside the walls of a federal prison. His case remains a central point of debate in the argument over executing a person convicted of directing a murder without personally pulling the trigger. This is Prison Files. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We open a new prison file 3 times a week.